Hey, everybody. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to get started because I am the last talk, so I'm like between you and your Lyft ride going home. And I also want to go home too as well. So I'll go ahead and get started. I do have a lot of stuff to go through, so I kind of want to get it all in without rushing too much. I am Brian Douglas, if you guys could see on the program. I'm going to talk about using GitHub's GraphQL API, mainly to manage open source projects, but think of this more as like a use case for using the API. So a lot of us already use GitHub's API, the REST portion of it. This is basically the showcasing the GraphQL API. All my slides are actually available on gucci.netlify.com. That is how you pronounce it. So if you guys want, if I go too fast or if you want to go home and maybe pour a glass of wine and go through these slides later on, feel free. They're right there. I'll also have that at the end too as well. So again, talking about the GitHub v4 API. And there was also a talk yesterday in this very room. Brooks, I'm pretty sure he's happy to have his face on the screen. He went through more details of how they got to this point, to the v4. I'm going to talk about how to use it. And the cool thing about the launching the v4 is that they actually launched it almost a year ago as beta when GitHub, when I say they, I'm talking about GitHub. GitHub announced at GitHub Universe using GraphQL as part of their API spec. Which is really cool because it got me excited about using GraphQL. It was something I heard about for a while, but never had a use case or a reason to stop production or go and try to figure out whatever this thing is. And GitHub was a good playground for me to try it out. So hopefully this talk will encourage you to learn GraphQL. And if you've got through this conference this far and haven't heard the word GraphQL, congratulations. I'm pretty sure like almost every single keynote over there, they've always been mentioning GraphQL and how they're very serious about it. But if you don't know what GraphQL at this point, it's a query-based language to grab data from your APIs. And that alone wasn't enough to get me excited, but it was very exciting to see something different between what I've already known, which was REST. So let me take a brief moment to explain who I am and where I came from. I actually write code at Netlify. I do a lot of speaking, and I do some tutorials and screencasts around Netlify. We're a continuous deployment platform for the modern developer, and we handle the workflow on modern web projects. And that web projects, asterisk, what I really mean is Jamstack. So Jamstack is a term that I really like using because it means JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So JavaScript really powers the web at this point. You can't really get away from it. Maybe in a few years we'll have like this weird closure mess that we can use like in some Firefox nightly browser. But until then, JavaScript's powering the web. So most front-end websites, most websites have JavaScript in them. And we like that term Jamstack to be able to explain what we do at Netlify. To further explain that, this is a monolith. So if you guys ever seen this jar before on the shelf when you were a kid, you got the peanut butter and jelly in the same jar. It's amazing for like the first scoop, but then after that it gets like really messy. That's a monolith. You kickstart the process of doing like peanut butter and jelly. You get the MVP really quickly, like 30 seconds, and you're back to playing like Nintendo or whatever. But the problem is like if you want just jelly or just peanut butter, you kind of have to go through this huge tech debt and like reorging and hiring and firing people and getting like your entire infrastructure different. So Jamstack really is just this. So you just separate your front end and your back end. And so you have an API, and then you have your front end and your client. Your client could be a mobile phone. It could be all those other things the last talk had, which is like all these 4K video screens and Alexa. And that's our clients. So we're talking about that, but mainly I'm talking about the web. So before I can talk about GraphQL, I got to talk about REST first as well. Is everybody familiar with REST at this point? You guys use it? You guys use the GitHub API at this point? So these are all endpoints for GitHub. You got like /user repositories and notifications. Ideally, if I go from the GitHub API and go to my app, I expect to get a user back, right? Does that kind of make sense? You guys tracking with me? All right, so if I go to /repositories, what do you think I'd get from /repositories? Repositories. Very good, you guys are following along. All right, so if I go to /notifications, what do you think you're going to get? You're not going to get notifications because it's not notifications, it's actually /user/notifications. But how am I supposed to know that unless I go fish through all the documentation or trial and error and figure out like what am I looking at? It's a big problem that I've had. I've been on like a couple different engineering teams, and when I first come on board to a team, I have to figure out what the backend looks like. And every engineer, I've always been on part of small companies, so every engineering team has no documentation around their API. So either I'm writing it or I'm just looking through test if we have test, or I'm just trial and erroring, figuring how that works. The good thing is GitHub has great documentation, so it's not that painful. The bad thing is that if I want to do a project and I wanted to have like user notifications, repositories into one project, I have to fetch it from 3 different endpoints and then some. So it's quite possible to get really lost in the docs, which is why I want to talk about GraphQL and why it's different from REST. So GraphQL takes what you would normally do with like multiple REST endpoints, and you can make that into one single request call. So I get to fetch the data I'm really looking for. And going back to that same model that I had before, this is the difference. So rather than straight hitting up the API, I'm actually talking to some sort of GraphQL schema or GraphQL layer. And the beauty of that is that I can wrap it all into one endpoint, which is /GraphQL. And that's exactly what you can do today. I also want to point out real quickly that GraphQL is not a replacement for REST. I think we've kind of learned that. If you went to Kyle's talk earlier, Marketplace is going forward with using GraphQL as new features, but you're still going to need to use the REST API until they get feature parity throughout the entire GraphQL spec, or the V4 API, I should call it. So it's not a replacement. It's actually more of an enhancer. So you're able to consume the data, and I personally think it's a lot nicer. I also like it because it fits in my jam. So GraphQL interactions, I'm just going to lay out some different interactions because I'm going to talk about them briefly as well. With GraphQL, you got the 2 things, which are queries and then mutations. If you think queries as gets and mutations as post, you can kind of keep it that way. That's higher level. I know underneath the hood, it's not really like that. But for gets and posts, you can do queries and mutations. And again, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but GraphQL really shines as being able to define the shape of the data that you want, and that's the data you get into your project. So going back to first queries, on the left I have a query, which I'm just identifying I want to get the Netlify owner, and then I want to find the GoTrue repo. And based on that, I want to pull back just names and just the issues for that repo. And on the right, you see my JSON data blob, which I'm getting exactly that data I want. So this is really powerful for specifically front-end developers. I think that's really where the use case was really hammered on at Facebook. As a front-end developer, you could actually just request the data you want, and if it's there, it'll come back to you, and if it's not, then you can go back to the API team and let them know to expose that in the schema. Mutations are, again, like post requests. So this is my example mutation that's working in the GitHub API where you can add a reaction to issues. So I just want to go to an issue and add a heart. I could do that with that just by finding the subject ID, which is the ID of that actual issue. So now let's get into how you actually get started with the GraphQL API. And as I mentioned before, it's just as simple as pointing just to the /GraphQL. So you could do all your fetch requests just as you wanted before from that same API. There's no /v4 that you have to actually put on there. And there's a really cool tool that was mentioned, I think, earlier in Brooks's talk, which is GraphQL Explorer. They also announced this last year. And GraphQL Explorer is just it's a GUI interface in the web that syncs up to the GitHub API. So you can actually query all the data for GitHub directly in the browser. And it looks like this. So this is the GUI. The cool thing about this is that you don't have to even find out what your token is. You don't have to auth anything. Well, you do have to auth, but you can do it from the upper right. Just clicking the button, you can log in and start doing GraphQL right away. Today, actually. Feel free to open up your laptops. So on the left pane, you can actually spec out the query. The cool thing about this is it auto-completes. So if you're not sure how to spell a repository, it'll spell it for you, similar to like VS Code or Xcode or something like that. And the next pane, that's where you get your data from. So very similar to my query, the shape of the data, and then returning the JSON. That's exactly what you're getting here in GraphQL Explorer. So I used to use GraphCool. GraphCool is what this is kind of based around. GraphCool is more of like an Electron app to do the very same thing. You just have to pass in your own tokens. I actually didn't start using Explorer till last week when I was preparing for this talk. And I kind of am kicking myself for not using this for this long because everything that I need is already there. And at this point, I've mainly only been using GraphQL with the GitHub API. And I have a little GIF that kind of shows the auto-completion. So I'm just like adding a name here and then adding a URL, so my repo URL. and then that data actually changes. So if I decide I want issues, I could delete those issues, and that data will just change exactly to the shape that I'm looking for. So that's kind of GraphQL in a nutshell. So I heard about the GraphQL API last year, and I really wanted to use it really bad, but I couldn't actually sell my team on just stopping production and adding GraphQL to our API. So I thought to myself, I'll just build a project to be able to test out this API, this GitHub API, and that's what I did. And I did it with this thought where GitHub is the place for open source. It's a place to discover open source. And I personally wanted to get involved in open source pretty badly. I'm already involved, but I wanted to get involved in more of a higher degree, starting to contribute to larger projects. The problem is, every time I go to start to contribute to a new project, I don't know exactly where to start. I don't know where issues. I know there are good, clever uses of labeling and talking to open source maintainers and contributors. But if you're not already inside the space, you don't know who to go to. Also, if you don't know how to use the actual projects, there's a lot of times I'll go to Hacker News, or I'll just find on like the GitHub Explorer tab, and I'll find the project that seems interesting. And then by the time the weekend comes around, I'll forget exactly what that project was. So I don't have a really good way of tracking what projects I can contribute to that I'm ready to contribute to, and I most likely will forget them eventually. And I've tried other tools like using Trello boards and Evernotes, and I end up just filling it up with all this data and never actually do anything with it. So, and I felt a bit like this. If you guys aren't familiar with Gucci Mane, he's a godfather of trap music. He's also a prophet, and he's a health food fanatic. He did an interview about 10 years ago talking about what it's like to get lost in the sauce. And this is a direct quote too: if you don't got sauce, then you lost. And knowing that, and knowing how much I love rap music, I thought, what if I made an open source project to manage open source projects on top of the GraphQL API and called it, oh, it froze. Ooh, I just got shocked. And I called it open sourced. Sorry, I don't know. OK, now I must have been rate limited with my Wi-Fi. Cool. That was a big flop. So I called it open sourced, and I'll just use my keyboard from now. So it's a way for me to take notes and save GitHub repositories for me to go ahead and contribute to these projects later. And the way I built it is I built it in this way. So this is like basically the infrastructure. I use React on the front end, and I use the GitHub API as a back end. And one thing that Kyle talked about in his talk is that they're really gung-ho on using GitHub as a platform. And that's exactly what I did here. I'm actually using GitHub as most of my back end. I'm using GraphCool, which is it started off as a backend as a service, a GraphQL as a service, but I think it's gotten way better than just that. And I'm using that to be able to save my node data as well as repository IDs. So I just took GitHub and GraphQL, and I made open source. So the next few slides, I'm going to show you exactly how I use the GitHub API to get some of these features into my application. So I'm going to start first with this fetching data. So that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm using GitHub as a platform. And I'm just pulling that data into my React app. And it looks like this. So I have a form where I'm just taking my GitHub URL, I'm hitting the GraphQL GitHub API endpoint, and I'm able to fetch just the data I need for those forms. So here in this form, I'm actually saving a little more data than I actually need, because I didn't really know where I was going with this project, to be quite honest. So I have a form that is collecting a lot of data, and I'm saving that to GraphCool, so mainly like this IDs and names. I also want to point out real quick that GraphQL, I actually do a lot of talking about GraphQL, and GraphQL is not a JavaScript thing, it's not a React thing. It's actually, GraphQL works with all modern languages and modern tooling, so frameworks, there's a lot of plugins and tools that people have built for this. But all these slides are JavaScript, so just to let you know. So I don't want you to think, oh man, I need to learn JavaScript because JavaScript's the future. I happen to use JavaScript, but I know GitHub's actually using GraphQL in their Ruby app. So the most basic way to get GraphQL into your app, if you're using JavaScript, you're using something like a node fetch, or you can use Axios. I'm a big fan of Axios. You just get that JSON back right away. And as you can see, I'm just using the straight-up api.github.com/GraphQL. And then from there, I'm just passing in my repo query. And then you're probably curious of why I'm passing in a repo query or where that's coming from. My repo query, I actually separate it into a different function, because it's a lot of I know there's a joke in the New York Times slide about template strings and not being able to syntax highlight. I sort of figured it out. But so I built my entire query. The same query that I showed you earlier is the same query that you're looking at here. It just has more data. And I'm passing that to a function that then returns my JSON data. So that JSON data I can throw in my React app, and I have code and content on the screen. So that's pretty much it for fetching data. That's the that's the easiest way to do it when you fetch it and passing the queries. I'll talk about another way in a moment. But I just want to take a moment just to talk about documentation. Documentation for a GraphQL is actually really nice. The cool thing about this is that inside the GraphQL Explorer or GraphCool, when you build your schema in the backend for GraphQL, all the documentation you put on top of your schema. So as you build your schema, you're writing exactly what these endpoints do. So if I want to know what an issue does, I can expect to find the documentation exactly what that is. If I can't spell repository correctly or repositories, then I can figure out and it will autocomplete for me and I can find it in the documentation. I can also find exactly what is inside of a repository. I can find that users have notifications and notifications don't have users. Oh, they technically do, but I could figure out the problem that I had earlier in a couple slides ago. And the cool thing about that is all the documentation is here. So I'm at the point where I'm no longer fishing through the GitHub documentation to figure out what exactly I need to do. I can actually just go into the GraphQL Explorer, start typing, and if I can think it, then it can probably happen. So let's talk about pagination edges. So repositories, issues, comments are all plurals. It means it's an array of data. And the idea of GraphQL, they're edges. So in edges, they all have nodes. So inside of those arrays, you have elements. And that was something I actually didn't have experience until I started getting to the problem where I wanted to have issues inside of my project. So with issues, I have this cool array over here that has 2 different colors. I have an issue inside that array. That's the object that I'm expecting whenever I return issues. Knowing that, I was able to discover that through the documentation here, which is exactly the same thing that I was just talking about before. But again, just reiterating that all the discovery I did for issues, I never went to the old API in the documentation. I went straight to GraphCool or the GraphQL Explorer and was able to find that. And I was able to find out too as well, when I was trying to return like every single issue known to man, I wasn't able to do that because inside the GraphQL, now I did go to the documentation to figure this out because I was a little baffled about this. But they do limit the amount of nodes that you can return as 100. But that's something that I was able to find out really quickly. And because of that, I was able to figure out how to actually get issues and do pagination as well. So here, when I'm fetching my issues in my project, I'm fetching the first 5 issues. And I'm able to paginate through those 5 issues. And I'm doing that within that query right here. So again, this is the same query I showed before. It's just now we're just looking at this issue point. So I'm able to pass in different elements to actually filter that data. And again, I'm passing the first 5 because I only want these issues to show up. So this is live UI. My UI, it's still a work in progress. Again, this project's open source, so if you are really good at UI, come talk to me. I will give you free GitHub hearts on any repo you want. So this is exactly what issues look like. I just wanted to paginate it. I wanted to be able to have some sort of discovery tool to find issues that I think I can contribute to. So you could also handle ordering and filtering. So I'm ordering descending, but I'm also ordering by only open issues. So if you notice in this object, I actually have states pointed out that I'm actually doing open. For whatever reason, if you wanted to find closed issues, you can find closed issues as well. So that's a good thing to think about too as well if you want to find pull requests or issues or comments that are actually open and available to you. And I did mention that you could actually order data too as well. So, and again, this is paginated issues, but also there was one thing I didn't know how to do, and it's funny because Brooks, you actually talked about this early in your talk, but I had to discover this the hard way. How can I paginate issues? If I'm going to get the first 5, how do I get the next 5? And the cool thing about the GraphQL API is that it gives you a cursor to be able to paginate through those as well. So that's paginating issues. You can do aliasing with edges. So when I get my React app and I get my data in JSON, if I have like data.edges, or sorry, if I have like repositories.edges, it doesn't really, my apologies, issues.edges is what I'm actually talking about. It's not very, I don't really know what that is if I'm not really up to speed with GraphQL, so I'm aliasing it as data. So I can go issues.data or this.props.issues.data as opposed to whatever edges are. I don't have to explain that with my team. So aliasing is cool because as a front-end developer, I can name anything I want in my front-end app of what I think it should be named. So if my head of infrastructure or API made a mistake in naming, I can prove it to them by renaming stuff on the fly. And as I mentioned before, cursors are built in. So cursors are something that GitHub gives you. So if you need to paginate something, you can find the cursor. So that way I can do exactly what you did with the V3 API and the previous ones where you have offsets. I can just recreate what offsets are by taking the next 5, offsetting from that cursor. Mutations. So, and this project, this open source project, I found out really quickly that mutations were pretty limited. So I didn't really have a use case to use in the actual project yet. So I was able to come up with an example last night about mutation, actually 2 nights ago. And I just wanted to figure out how mutations work because I thought, oh, wow, I'm about to do a talk, and I've never done mutations for the GitHub API. So that's a mutation right there. If you go literally to the GraphQL Explorer and you type mu, like MU, it'll autocomplete from mutation. And then if you type mutation, it'll show you all the open mutations that they have available for you. And you can read the documentation right in GraphQL Explorer exactly what these are. A lot of them, actually every single one of them are pretty explanatory what it is. So add reaction to issue, or add reaction is something that it's not specific to issues. You can add reactions to multiple things, I believe, on GitHub. My use case that I thought through that I actually do are issue reactions. But I believe you can do comment, that subject ID can also be a common ID as well. And again, I was able to discover this on the fly 2 nights ago by using the GraphQL Explorer documentation, which is great. One other feature that I actually wanted to do was actually save data. So I knew I wanted to store notes based on repository data. So if I found a repository I knew I wanted to follow and stalk, this is basically a stalking platform, if you haven't really realized yet. So if I wanted to stalk a repo and I wanted to save note data, there's no way for me to save notes in the GitHub API that I know of. I don't know if it's an enterprise feature, but it'd be cool to have that in-house. So I'm using a tool called GraphCool. Has anybody heard of GraphCool? So it almost looks like GraphQL, but it's really GraphCool. And I'm using this, again, it's a database GraphQL as a service, and then some. So it provides a lot of things like serverless functions and authentication for you. And I'm using it so I can persist data somewhere else. And I'm doing that by talking to GraphCool, but also using a tool called Apollo. So Apollo is a front-end client that can consume GraphQL data. It's more than that at this point. They're actually doing a GraphQL summit next week. You can also introspect like Postgres databases and Mongo and build GraphQL schemas based on that, so you can infer that. So if you don't want to spend all the time to build your own backend GraphQL, and you don't want to spend money on GraphCool, which mostly is free, you can also infer that on your existing databases as well. And GraphCool looks like this, where they actually have they call it a playground. It's very similar to the GraphQL Explorer, or the GitHub GraphQL Explorer is what it really is. And they have that available for you, but you can also modify and build your schema on the back end. So if you don't have a back end, this is like almost like if you call it the Firebase of GraphQL. And with Apollo, if you guys are familiar with JavaScript and React, there's a thing called Redux, and you have a provider in Redux, if you're familiar. Apollo has this very similar thing where you have a provider where I can pass in my GraphQL layer on the very highest component, so in my architecture, and it looks like that. And it only really needs to take a GraphQL endpoint. So here I'm passing a GraphCool endpoint. If you really wanted to, you could pass in the api.github.com/GraphQL there. And you could actually get GraphQL directly into your application. So you can bypass the entire fetching data inside of your own functions from Axios and just go straight Apollo if you wanted to as well. So, and that's what it looks like, the Apollo provider. I'm passing in the client there. And the one reason the biggest reason what got me interested in Apollo is because Apollo is actually, it's a company that came out of Meteor. It's Meteor, and Apollo is just another working group inside of Meteor. And they're building tooling around GraphQL, so things like analytics based on queries. You can get that through Apollo Optics, which is a cool tool. You get up to 1 million requests, it's free. So highly recommend checking it out because you can kind of like introspect your queries. You can actually, if you're using SQL, you can actually see what the SQL calls will look like equivalent to your GraphQL calls. So if you want to identify anything that's n+1 queries or opportunity for batching, there's a thing called batching with with GraphQL, where instead of going to user repositories and then issues, and then going somewhere else, you can actually batch all that into one query, and which is really the power where GraphQL comes from, by actually just going just to one query and fetching data at one time. Apollo also, sorry, I'm selling Apollo pretty hard. I didn't think I was going to do this, but Apollo has a good caching layer as well. So if you want to cache queries, so imagine I'm going to get all my repository data. I already know I want this data. If I go to the next page, I need that data with me. So you can cache that through Apollo using, under the hood, it's like local storage, I believe. So my mutation for this is no longer they're going to be the GraphQL API. Now I'm going to be talking directly to GraphCool using the data that I've saved previously. But here I can update a repository. So this is a mutation I wrote, and this is what it looks like. So it's the opposite of a query. Queries, again, are the gets. These are the posts. I'm just passing in objects into it. So I get to define that I want a string and an ID, and then I can pass that in to send straight to GraphCool so I can set that database up. And this is again, this is a UI. It's still a work in progress, so holler at me if you guys are interested. But this is where I save notes. So this is a screen. And within my saving note component, I have my GraphQL query co-located in the same component. So this is another selling point that I liked for the front end for React. Again, GraphQL is not just a React thing. It just came from Facebook. So they're really big in the React at Facebook, apparently. But I can co-locate my query right inside the same file. So everything I need to know is right there in the same file. And I love this for doing React Native applications where I only have two screens. I think this is a little more elegant of a solution when everything's all on the same page that I need to look at. And then I mentioned the queries down there, but then I have a regular function inside of my React component where I can then call this .props create repo, which there's a little more React that's happening there, but just understand that I'm calling a function from a mutation that I created. So my mutation gets added to my React component, and I can fire that to save data, just like I would do any other JavaScript function. So I went through all this, and I kind of wrapped up that project. But I went through all this, and I found out really quickly that there's a lot of things missing from the GitHub v4 API. I know they're working really hard to expand that with all the missing things. Like things like notifications is actually something I can't get from the GraphQL API. I still have to go REST for that. I highly recommend, it's been announced a couple times, but the GitHub platform, there's a GraphQL section where you can actually request certain things, or you can find out if there's certain things coming in the pipeline that you're interested about. So if there's a business case that you want to go all GraphQL for, definitely check out the forums for that. I also mentioned a lot about GraphCool. I spent a good amount of time talking about them. But just last week, they announced this thing called resolver functions. And these resolver functions are, again, it's more than just backend as a service. These are Lambda functions that run alongside your database. So if I want to fire different functions like authentication or providing a resolver for my GraphQL schema, I can do that within GraphCool. And what that really means is that so far I've been talking to two different databases. I've been talking to GitHub. I've been talking to GraphCool. I can now just talk to one schema, which is going to be my schema. So I like using the term called GraphQL Gateway, like API Gateway. And I could build something just like this, which I've already started building this. I haven't finished it yet. But I can actually take in the GitHub API into resolver functions and expose that right next to my schema. So every API call all comes from my GraphCool endpoint as well. But I'm still using the GitHub API alongside of it. And there's also a cool thing that just was announced 2 weeks ago called schema stitching. So you can actually stitch, like literally take two schemas, so one being the GitHub schema, and the other one being my schema, and stitch them together. So, and Apollo, actually. So with that being said, I can now have one unified schema using GitHub GraphQL and not have to talk, and my GraphCool endpoint, and not have to talk to two different backends at this point. So that's something I'm really excited about. I'm hopefully going to start doing that in the next few weeks if you want to follow along. My repo is at github.com/bduggy/opensauced. And I just bought a TLD this morning that I wanted to announce, which is opensauce.pizza. So look for pizza gifts and stuff like that in my app. Unless I get VC funding, then I go straight serious. We go enterprise at that point. And again, my slides are at gucci.netlify.com. I also want to mention, I talked to the whole interest in GraphQL actually started from one, coming to GitHub Universe last year, but two, I got the chance to talk with Kyle, who kind of led the efforts for the GraphQL at GitHub. I talked to him on my Jamstack podcast. So if you guys are interested in hearing what all the intentions came from for doing GraphQL, and if you want to hear like the origin story about that, definitely check out that episode with me. So I get to close the entire conference, so I'm going to close it like this. Don't get lost, stay saucy, GitHub Universe. And this is me on Twitter, so if you guys want to follow my efforts in GraphQL and this project, definitely follow me, ask me questions. I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I've been doing it for at least a few weeks, hardcore. Not as hardcore for the past 9 months, but it is what it is. So thanks, guys.